So let's start this and meet our presenter. So, hi, Shimona. How are you?
Hi, Melissa, and hi, everyone. I'm good. I'm really
Great.
excited for this session.
So, I'm Melissa. I'm the host of this session, and I'm in Spain. Where are you, Shimona?
I am from Delhi, India.
Wow, it's a city I've always wanted to visit. Looks amazing. So, we're really happy to have you here. I'm going to tell the audience a bit about you. So, this is Shimona Tyagi. She's currently working in Delhi as a teacher and a curriculum developer for primary and lower secondary age students. So, if that's your age group, perfect, you're in the right place. As well as teaching, she's also mentored in service teachers, helping them to conduct classroom based research. And her speciality topic, her favorite thing in the world, is reading and storytelling and stories. And that's what she's come to talk to us about. So, the title of her webinar today is, well, it's about short stories in the classroom. I think everyone's going to love this. There's lots of ideas, so let's get started. Shimona, when you're ready, you can share your slides.
Sure. Thank you so much for this warm welcome, Melissa. I'm just sharing my screen.
Great.
I hope my screen is visible to everyone. Hi. Um,
Yes.
Today we're going to talk about how can teachers use short stories. And the keyword here is short stories. So we are going to specifically stick to short stories in today's session and how we can use them in the classroom. A few experiences coming from my end as well. So let's quickly move on to the flow of today's session. So today's session is divided into three parts: what, how, and why. Firstly, we're going to talk about what are short stories and how are short stories different from novels and novellas. A few characteristics and elements of short stories are also we are going to look upon, is something we're going to look upon. Secondly, we're going to talk about how to select appropriate short stories for the class. So what are the steps you're going to follow? What are the things you need to be careful about? This is what we're going to cover in this particular segment. And finally, we'll go to the third segment, which is the why, importance of short stories, because we are going to talk about what are short stories, but why do we even have to take them in our classrooms? This is something that we're going to talk about in the last segment with a few tips and strategies, along with a few apps and websites that I have explored in my classroom. So that is going to be really interesting for you people. And finally, we'll have time for questions where I'm going to take up a few questions from your end, and we are going to discuss about a few things, right? So let's get started with the first segment, which is what. So what? First, let us understand the meaning of short stories. So before moving and diving into the session, I would want to know your understanding of short stories. What do you think short stories are? For this, I would want you to quickly move to your chat boxes and answer the question on your screen, which is, according to you, what is a short story? And how often do you use it in your language classroom? So you can just write a phrase or a word that you think is relatable to the word short story, along with how often do you use it in your classroom? Maybe once in a week, twice in a month, or whatever. So you have a minute to do this, and I'm opening my chat box to look at your answers. Okay, I'm getting a lot of responses. Once in a week, limited numbering of pages in short stories. Um, a teacher has also written that stories with morals at the end. Okay. A prose, a fiction is also something a teacher responded. Okay, it's lovely to see how teachers are writing that they take short stories so often in their classroom, like twice in a week. This is great. If you're able to do this in your classroom, this is really interesting. Twice in a week is something that I'm repetitively reading in the chat box. And many of the teachers are also trying to relate short stories with traditional tales and folk tales. So yeah, they are a kind of short stories, but not really. And many of you are rightly writing that it's a fictional text. So yes, majorly the short stories are fictional in nature. Thank you for your lovely responses, teachers. I'm really, really amazed to read how often you're able to take the short stories in your classroom and what, according to you, is a short story. I could read a few really interesting responses. I've also collated a few responses from my end, and let's have a look at them as well, where we're going to discuss in a little bit detail what short stories actually are. So there are a few characteristics of short stories. Just a minute. I'm sorry, I'll just share my screen again. Okay. Yes, the characteristics of short stories that we were talking about, they're fictional stories which we've already covered and you people are already aware. They usually finish in one sitting, which also, again, a lot of you pointed out in the chat box that they're really short and you're able to finish it quickly in one sitting. Now, what is the essential part is the length of the short stories, which is 1,000 to 7,500 words. This is the actual length, and majorly, most of the short stories fall between this particular length only. There can be an exceptions here and there, but this is the major numbering of words which the short stories contain. Along with this, if any short story is less than 1,000 words, then it's interestingly called a short fiction or a flash fiction. And if it's even lesser than like 300 words, it's called a microfiction. Now, these terminologies, these words that we are, discussing here are important to use in the classrooms because sometimes, we try to synonymously use a lot of words in the classroom where the students might get confused. But using proper words like, today we're going to read a flash fiction, or today we are going to have, we're going to read a micro fiction. Things like this will make our classes more interesting. Students will be able to identify the different kind of short stories as well, and they'll be able to involve themselves in a better way, in an efficient way, perhaps. Finally, a short story is one that has a single plot. So single plot is something um, which we will notice in the short stories. Multiple plots are usually contained in novels and novellas, the bigger stories. But in short stories, usually the author sticks to a single plot and talks about it. So these are the basic characteristics of short stories. And whenever we are trying to select a short story in a classroom, or we are trying to help students identify between different kinds of stories. So these are a few things which we can be careful about. Now, moving forward to the most interesting part is how is the dish of short stories prepared? Now, just like you're making any dish and you require a few ingredients in a few proportion, and this is how the dish will taste, delicious. Similarly, when we are picking up short stories or when we are reading short stories, what are those ingredients because of which that particular short story will, taste really good or, sound really good to us? So those two um, ingredients would be characters and plot. So any short story that you pick and that you really want to take up in the classroom, you need to check out for these two things, the character and the plot. These two things are the essentials or the essential ingredients of any short stories. There can be other things as well that I've mentioned below, which are the narration, the point of view, setting, theme, genre. These things might or might not be present in a short story. Um, it can, differ. But characters and plot, they'll be stable and they will be a part of short story, every short story for that matter. So we are supposed to look at these two things whenever we are, trying to take any short story in a classroom. In the coming up slides, we'll also be talking about characters and plot in detail because, again, these are the two main ingredients. That's what we were talking about. So let's quickly move to the characters part, which is any story, short story that we pick up, we are going to look forward to two types of characters, the round characters and the flat characters. Round, as the name suggests, just like a sphere, they're multi-dimensional and usually the main characters, and they have multiple layers, which we fold while we are reading them, which we unfold while we are reading them. And we also have flat characters, which are usually the minor characters, and as the name suggests, they are flat and they're unidimensional. They're simple, and we are not able to, understand or get to know more about them because not a lot of information has been provided about those particular characters. So whenever we are selecting or we are, wanting to take any particular story in the classroom, these uh, two types of characters are something we are supposed to look forward to, round and flat. And uh, particularly any good short story would contain both the types of characters, right? Now, moving on to the second most important element, which is the plot. Let's quickly move on to the plot slide. This is a very, very interesting picture. If you closely look at this picture, this is a plot mountain. Um, so here, as you can see, it's in a shape of a mountain, and it starts with exposition, which is basically the introduction of any story, leading on to a rise. You can also see the picture where we're talking about the inciting incident or any problem that is arising in the story. So after the introduction of the story, there's usually a problem that comes up, finally leading to the climax of the story, also known as the most interesting part of the story. Usually in the climax, we have a new introduction of a character, any good twists and turns, because of which the entire story changes, the entire course of the story changes. Finally, there's denouement as the mountain goes down, the problem starts solving, and there are a few characters, or you can say any solutions being suggested, some clues being given, because of which the problem is getting solved, finally leading to the end of the story. So this is the plot mountain, and I would suggest that for teachers who are not really well aware of this plot mountain, this will actually help you in your classrooms, even if you want to go back to revising the story or reflecting upon the story, and even if you want to check how much the students have understood the story, these particular elements of the plot mountain will actually help us understand how much our students have understood that particular story. So this plot mountain, I think, is a must to use in the classrooms. Moving on, this plot mountain is actually nothing but these three major parts of the story, which is the beginning, the middle, and the end. The beginning contains the exposition and the rising action where the problem comes in. Middle usually is the crisis situation and the climax. And the end of the story is usually the falling action where the problem starts solving, and the resolution, which is basically the end of the story. So these are the parts of the story plot, and we can use them interestingly in our classes. However, while choosing stories for a classroom, we need to be a little bit aware of stories which sometimes not have a proper end, or did not have a proper introduction or exposition. So if we are, trying to introduce a short story in our classroom, we will try to use stories which will contain all these three things in proper amount, in a way that, would not confuse the students. So just be careful of using them while selecting a story. Now, since we've been talking about plot, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up a story, Cinderella. I think this is a story which most of you or all of you must have read in your childhood, or you've also taught in your classes. For that matter, it's a very famous fairy tale. So we'll try using the story of Cinderella in this plot mountain that we're talking about. So I have done a few things, and there's also a task for you at the second option. You can look at this slide where on the left hand side we have the parts of a story plot. On the right hand side, we have the example of Cinderella. Um, you can see that I have mentioned almost everything. However, there's a space for you to fill, which is a rising action or the conflict. So, what was actually the conflict in the story Cinderella? I would want you to move again to your chat boxes and respond that what was the conflict in the story of Cinderella, so that we can complete this plot mountain. So I'm moving on to my chat box, and we have a few seconds to quickly answer this question. Okay, I'm waiting for the responses in the chat box. I hope the question is clear to everyone that we're supposed to write what could be the conflict in the story Cinderella. Okay, I'm getting a lot of responses. She meets a prince. That's the conflict. I just read this response from a teacher. Um, okay, interesting. One of the teachers wrote that she was not taken to the ball. Yes, this is exactly what the conflict is, that the stepsisters and the mother were not planning to take her, and they were preventing her to go to the ball. That's interesting. A lot of responses how the stepmother is the conflict or the problem in the story, the stepsister is the conflict in the story, um, how there's a disagreement in the family. Very interesting responses, and I'm also able to look at this particular story in a different light now. However, we'll stick to the conflict which we discussed some time back, that how she was being prevented, that there was this invitation and she was being prevented to go to that ball, and then she finds her own ways to go to that particular ball. So that's the conflict that we talked about. Finally, the climax where finally it's seen that that particular slipper is that of Cinderella only, and then both of them marry, and the resolution that they live happily. It was really interesting to read your responses, teachers. I'm happy that you are able to look at the story in a very different way as well. Um, Now, quickly, um, I just want to say this. This is something interesting. It's a quick activity that I usually take up in my classroom when we're discussing the plot mountain. A few things missing here and there will actually generate a lot of interest in the student's mind, and will also bring a lot of clarity with respect to the story and the plot mountain. So, using such fill in the blanks and asking the students to uh, use the story in such a way, or guess what could be the climax or the exposition, or it can be vice versa. Ask them to identify, if you're given something, that what which part of the story plot it is. This can be an interesting activity to be taken up in the classroom. Thank you so much for your lovely responses. Now let's move ahead. I'll just stop my screen share for a while, and I'll share it again. So we've almost come to the last segment of the first thing, what? We've discussed a lot about short stories. And finally, we're going to talk about two things, story and plot. We usually, uh, you know, use both of these words so synonymously, and sometimes even I get confused while using them in my classroom. But as teachers, we need to understand the basic difference between both of these words. So story is actually what happens in the story in a particular sequence. For example, we talked about the story of Cinderella, so we had a proper sequence that we were discussing in the previous slide. That's the story. But if I pick up one particular incident, for example, that she is invited to a ball and she meets the prince there, and I begin the story from that particular part. That is my plot. Plot is nothing but how I am probably presenting the story to the readers. So this is something that we need to be careful about. Using both the words synonymously will not work. Story means what happens in the story in a particular sequence, but plot is the sequence of how that particular story is being presented to the audience. So I hope now we'll try to use these words correctly in a proper way. With this, we've come to the end of the first segment, which is the what. I hope we were able to understand what short stories are and a few characteristics of the short stories with a few examples that we discussed, along with the character and plot being the two main ingredients of any short stories. Now, quickly moving on to the next slide, which is the how part. So, how to select an appropriate short story for the class. So, there can be a lot of ways, and there can be a lot of tricks that US teachers must be using in your classroom while selecting the short stories. So what we are going to do is we are also going to do it through a quick activity where you are going to see two stories on your screen, story one and story two. The story one is the Sydney Zoo, and story two is the caterpillar. And these are actually the summaries of the short stories. And I would want you to go quickly through these stories and write in the chat box which one would you prefer to take up in your classroom. Um, Say it's a grade 5 classroom. So now with that, the discussion that we've had in the previous slides, try to use that information and try to select an appropriate story that you would like to take up in your classroom. Just write story one or story two in the chat box, and you can also write the reason as to why would you, use that particular story in the classroom. So we have a few seconds. Quickly, we'll just move on to the chat box and first give it a read and then move on to the chat box and write which one would you prefer and why. So I'm waiting for your responses. Okay. Most of the teachers in the chat box are writing that they would go with story two, and it has a perfect ending, it has a lesson, and they can relate to growth, is what one teacher says in the chat box. Um, a teacher also says a second story because it can be used in multiple contexts. So, like it is the multidisciplinary approach. Yes, the integrated approach is something that we can follow through that story. um, Many of you uh, are suggesting story two, and personally, if 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 asked this question, I would also select story two because we have discussed a lot of things in the previous slide about how a short story is supposed to be and how we're supposed to take it up in the classroom. What are the things which are essentials in in a short story, and what will help us to select a perfect short story for the classroom, and particularly um, that second story helps us to understand all the parts that we were talking about, beginning, middle, end, the starting of the story, and other details in a more defined manner. So I would also like to go with story two. However, there are a few things that I would like to share as to what will be um, the things that I will keep in mind before selecting a short story. So I'm pretty sure while reading those two stories, you also had a few things going on in your head. You would also have had that thought that, why this particular story. You've also mentioned it. However, I also have a different take on it, which is an age appropriate story, since I mentioned grade 5. So something that is understandable to the grade 5 students. Second, the context of the story. So while we are selecting a short story, the context of the story is something which we will try to concentrate upon, and we will try to use stories that are relatable in our particular context. So now this is a very subjective thing. If we are probably teaching the primary grades, so a relatable context is something that we will aim for. However, if the grades are, say, the middle grades or the senior grades for that matter, then probably moving on to different context and giving them a different viewpoint and giving them that opportunity to know about different context can be a great idea. So we can, concentrate on the context as per the grades that we are teaching. So context is also one of the major factors while selecting a short story in the classroom. The third thing would be that we've, I think, churned out in a very, very nice manner in the previous slides, the beginning, middle, and end. So we need to be very careful of what kind of story we're taking in the classroom, what kind of end that story has, and what are we also aiming at the end of that particular story, what are we aiming at? So yes, so selecting stories containing a proper beginning, middle, and end. Finally, the level of the story in terms of vocabulary is something which is a necessity as well. And the last thing is the content interests your student or not. I think this should be the primary focus of us. Sometimes I plan a story which is age appropriate, which has, the best vocabulary for my students, which has beginning, middle, end in a proper sequence, in a proper manner. Everything is really, really exciting to me. But when I take it to my students, they are really bored and they don't like it. Maybe the theme is really confusing or not something that they might be interested in. So interest, the content of the story should be such that it interests my learners. So I need to think from their perspective, not what I really am interested in, but what they might be interested in. So this is going to be a game changer of while you're selecting short stories in your classroom. I hope now I think we'll be able to select better stories for our classes. Moving on to the last segment of today's session, which is the why part, importance of short stories in a language classroom. So we've been talking about what a short story is, how would you define it, how often do we take it in the classroom, what are the major ingredients, etc., etc. But why short stories? Why not novels? Why not any other thing? Why particularly short stories, and how are they helpful to us? So we'll be talking about this particular thing in this segment. Okay. First of all, the first point is very obvious, vocabulary and language development. Now, this can be through any kind of stories, not short stories, but any kind of stories as well. It helps in the development of critical thinking in our learners while we are selecting appropriate short stories with well-defined, rounded characters. I think the critical thinking would be peaked. So yes, selection plays a vital role here if we are aiming at the upliftment of the critical thinking in our learners. The students will be able to look at things from multiple viewpoints. Now, if we look at the characters' actions in a particular story, and then we'll also be able to understand their point of view. Why did they do a particular action? We'll be probably able to empathize with the character. We'll be able to relate with the characters. We'll also we'll be able to sensitize towards those characters as to why they've taken those particular decisions in that particular story. Moving on, students are exposed to various contexts. So, of course, we've talked about context in the previous slides as well, where we talked about how context plays a very integral part while taking up any story. So when I take up stories in my classroom, I what I do is when I find a story which is very interesting and I would want to take it in my classroom. However, the context is not relatable to my students. I usually change the settings. I usually change the names which are more relatable to my students. So this can be a good trick that if you really want to take a particular story, you can change the names or the settings, or you can make a few modifications in that particular story and then probably narrate or take it up in your classroom. Um, Talking about various contexts, I once took a project in my class where we talked about around the world with Cinderella, where we discussed some 8 to 10 versions of different stories of Cinderella in different parts of the world. So that the students got to know that the version of Cinderella that they were reading in their country was so different than that which the other students are probably reading or reading in their countries. So with this particular change in the context, they were able to realize that one particular story is perceived or read in so many different ways. So we can explore more such stories which have different versions in different countries, and this will probably make them more interested in stories and even help them to explore a lot of other stories. Problem solving and prediction skills are also developed, of course, when we are narrating a story, or when the students are reading the text. We probably use such skills in between, where we are asking the students a few questions. What might happen next? Guess what would the character do? What would you do in the place of that character? Things like this makes the class more interactive, and this also helps them use their creativity and imagination as to what might have happened in the story. So this is also the next point. All of these things can be linked to the plot mountain that we talked about, as to, giving them the story till climax and asking them what would happen after that. So small activities like this can actually make our classes more interesting. And in this way, a lot of a lot of developments of the children takes place when we take up such short stories in the classroom. So not just the vocabulary or the language skills, which is an obvious thing, but apart from this, there are problem solving skills, the prediction skills, the the knowledge of different cultures and things like that, that helps the students stick to the short stories. Now, why personally I like to stick to short stories is that they're very short. This is something which we come across when I take a novel in my classroom. um, Sometimes there are a lot of holidays that come in between and the flow of the story breaks, but with short stories that's never the case. And short stories go smooth in the classroom, they finish really quick while you're taking them up. So short stories can be a good, I wouldn't say a replacement for novels, but a good option to explore if you haven't explored them yet. Moving on to a few strategies of using short stories in your classroom would be before using a story, which is schema activation, where we are just trying to understand um, how much the students are already aware about the theme that is supposed to be linked to the story. Secondly, the why, where we are when we are using a story, where we are using certain prediction skills just to develop the interest of our readers. And finally, after using a story, where we are aiming at the reflection part, where they can revisit the story and answer a few questions, where we can also check whether they have understood the story in a proper manner or not. So I have a few activities coming up in the next slide, which I have personally used in my classroom, which have really, really worked for me. And I would love to share them with you all as well. So while using schema activation, I usually try to pick up the theme of the short story where I ask them a few questions. I play games which are directly linked to the theme. For example, if it's upon pet animals or animals, I usually ask them their personal experiences of having a pet animal, or even me telling my personal anecdotes to the students, where I'm telling them how was my experience of having a pet, and how do you take care of your pets, and how have I taken care of my pet. Things like that help the students relate to the story in a better way, and they will be able to probably connect with the story that we are about to take in an efficient manner. One more example that I really like, that whenever I'm taking any story of the genre adventure, I usually try to ask them which is your favorite adventure, and if you want to go to this particular adventure, which things would you carry along with yourself, which are the essentials that you would carry along with yourself. And I usually tell them to draw and speak about them, and this actually creates so much of enthusiasm and energy in the classroom that they're excited to see that the character in the story that we're going to read about um, went to which adventure. So this actually creates a hype whenever we're taking a short story in the classroom. Moving on to the prediction, which is the wild reading part of the story. Sometimes, while taking short stories also becomes boring in the classroom. The students might not pay a lot of attention. They might feel as if, they're just reading the text and there's nothing interesting coming up. So having in between activities like, the prediction activities, for example, you know, telling them half of the story and asking them what happens next, draw a comic strip of that, of the next events, draw two comic strips of it. So, or giving them a particular option and then asking them what might have happened in the story, or if you would have been in the character's place, what would you have done? So prediction questions like this in between actually helps the class to become more lively. The students become more interested. They also try to help each other, they try to question, they try to answer each other. In terms of prediction. And just like you gave a lot of different responses in the chat box, believe me, the students give some amazing responses, and I really enjoy such prediction classes. So if you haven't tried this in between your text, try to use it even often. Moving on to the last part, which is the reflection. um, I usually ask my students to create a new ending. Okay, this is the ending which the author has already provided. So, which is the ending that you would want to give if you were, you're not satisfied with the ending, or which is that one gift now that you know so much about the character? What is that one gift that you would like to give to the character? Or why not create a Facebook page of a favorite character, or perhaps a poster on the theme of the story. Such activities actually help the students to reflect back on the story, and they will be able to analyze the characters and the plot in a better way. Probably they must not have thought what is the gift I would like to probably give the character. But when thinking about this question, they will visit back to the characteristics, the things that the character liked, the traits of that character. That what would I give that particular character that he or she will actually become happy, or he or she, it would be helpful to that particular character. So these particular activities actually help us to also know whether the students have understood the characters and the story in a better way, and also help them evaluate whether they have understood the story or not. So these are a few activities that I have been using while taking up short stories in my classroom, and I think many of you might have used a few of them. So if not, you can try taking up such activities while you're taking up a short story in the classroom. Moving on to using Bloom's taxonomy. Now, I think many of the teachers would have been are aware of Bloom's taxonomy and the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Now, as a teacher who is teaching literature in the classroom, uh, giving exposures of short story is something I do in my classrooms. However, what I aim at is reaching to the highest level, which is the creation level, where I aim that all my students, after understanding and reading so many short stories, are also able to create short stories. So, not just enjoying and reading them, but also being able to understand the nuances of short stories and being able to create one is something I personally aim at. So, we are going to talk about a few creational things in the further slides as well. However, if I talk about the Bloom's taxonomy and the different levels, there are a few activities that I usually take up in my classroom at different levels, which I'll be sharing. For example, at the first level where we're talking about, remember, usually in the primary grades, we ask the students to, draw about the main characters or the settings of the story so that, the first level is checked, or we're able to see whether the students have reached to that first level or not. Secondly, the understanding level where we can give simple tasks like, identify the flat and the round characters, the major and the minor characters from the story, and describe them in the manner of the physical appearance. Moving on to the applying part where they're able to, make a comic strip of the story that they've already read. The analyzing part where, they'll be able to differentiate between the various characters um, in the story, how they are different and how they are similar, compare and contrast activities basically. In the evaluation part, we usually move to more, the critical part of analyzing the character and, digging deeper into the character. And finally, the creational part that I was talking about, where we can ask the students to create their own versions of short stories. We can also ask them to create the prequels or sequels of short stories. And this can be a really interesting task. Believe me, I've done it after taking a few short stories in my classroom, and students actually enjoy creating their own prequels and sequels in the classroom and then presenting them. And this also helps us understand how the students have perceived that particular story and how they're able to track it in the form of a prequel and how they're able to move forward in the form of a sequel. So this can be an interesting activity. It can be time taking, but once the students are clear with characters, they're clear with the plot mountain, I think it becomes easier for the students to create their own masterpiece. Um, with this, I'm going to share a live demo of a few sites and apps that I have explored. The first one is from the British Council itself, where we are going to create a story. I'm going to quickly stop my screen share and take you directly to the link. So this is the story maker. As you can, I hope my screen is visible to everyone. This is story maker. Usually for the primary grades, this can be a very helpful activity. I'm going to, demo it to you as well. It's an interesting piece of work. However, before running it through, I would also like to tell you that uh, this particular website or app can be used for the primary graders, where they'll be able to, they're at that stage where they're building the story. They are probably selecting the characters, they're selecting the settings of the story, or they're selecting the major events of the story, right? So after selecting these particular events, the story maker actually makes the story. So the students do not make the story, they just select the major elements of the story and automatically the story generated. So let's try it out, and I think then you will be able to understand this in a better way. So I'll just click on play now, and it says start. I'll click on the start button. Now it gives me a choice. It gives me three genres from which I can select. Probably I'll go with a science fiction story. I want to create a science fiction story today. And here is the series of that question I was talking about, where I can select a few important events of the story. There's a planet in the story. What's the planet's name? Probably Mishmash is something I'm liking, so I'll just click on it. There's a spaceship in the story. What's it like? It's silver. What's the planet like? Really hot. There's an alien in the story. What's it like? Slimy, maybe. What color is the alien? Purple, maybe. And there are some dangerous people or creatures in the story. What are they? Monsters. And with all of that selection that I did, there's this story which has been created. It is the year 3034, and you can see it's a science fiction story because I selected that genre. So this is an amazing way of giving the exposure to various genres to the students, helping them select the main ingredients or the main elements of the story. For example, we talked about the setting, we talked about the character. Here there was a protagonist and an antagonist. There were a few colors related to the setting of the story. So the students will get this opportunity of selecting the major elements of the story and then probably moving towards the final part of the story. So this can be something which can be tried with the younger students where they are in the creational part of the story. And with the bigger students, I think, just giving the genre and moving towards a few elements can help them create their own stories. This app can be used particularly for the primary graders, where they're just learning about short stories and creation and the creation of short stories. I'll just stop my screen share and just give me a while. Okay. Okay, so finally we come to a few other apps and websites that I have explored in my classroom that actually help students create short stories, and they can be a great tool in the classroom when you are aiming at the creational level, probably in the higher grades, where the students know what short stories are, what are the ingredients, what are the elements, what is the plot mountain, and things like that. They can explore these websites, and you can help them walk through these websites. The first, the Story Jumper, where the students can actually become authors and write their own stories. Second one is also quite similar, where the students involve themselves in effective writing, and it's called the Story Bird. And finally, the Book Creator, as the name suggests, it helps in creating stories in the classroom, where students can write and publish their stories. So these three are the websites that I have explored, along with the one that I have showed in the previous slide, which which I have used with my students. And believe me, the students really, really enjoy while creating. Since I've recently been working with the middle graders, so using such websites and apps actually help them, um, try to practically use what they're learning in the classes, like the elements of short stories. They're trying to use it in a proper way. They're trying to weave a story out of it, so it becomes really exciting where they're trying to apply that knowledge which they've learned in their classes. So with this, I think we've come to the end of webinar, and that's all from my side. However, I have the last question in front of you people, that how confident do you now feel in using short stories in your classroom? It's a scale from 1 to 5, and not just in language classrooms, but I hope the teachers teaching other subjects, taking short stories from different contexts can be useful. So how confident do you feel now? I really would want to know this. And then over to you, Melissa. I am just reading the responses.
Me too, Shimona. Are you reading these? There's so
Yes,
many
yes.
fives.
Yeah, yeah. I can see that I'm really overwhelmed.
Yeah, there's some fours. I mean, it's okay to not feel 100% confident, but
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Wow, great. Yeah. So Gabrielle says that was fantastic. I feel like a five. Great. We think so too. Ludmila says, what a wonderful presentation. Thank you. Yeah, I reflect. I want to reflect that. That was great. So, Shimona, you can stop screen sharing now, and then let's take some questions from the audience. I know that there
Sure,
are
sure.
lots of questions coming up. Okay, so what questions do we have? Well, there's still time to send questions. So if you want to write a question in the comments in Facebook, then we can take them from there. If you're watching on Zoom, you can write a question in the Q&A area and we'll take them. So, let's take a look. Um, I mean, you talk mostly about reading. Of course, there's not time to talk about everything, but Nabila asks, how can we make story writing more interesting for students? Because some students don't want to write a story. Is that something you have experience in, Shimona?
Yeah, I would like to take up this question. So yes, story narration is something that the students enjoy. They really like listening to stories, and they like to visualize things. And story writing is something that many students get stuck at, and I'm totally able to relate,
Yeah.
because recently also we did an activity in the school, and when I went and talked to the students, there were a few questions I gave them, and I went and asked them that how's your experience, are you really liking it? And many of them said boring. It's boring to write a
Oh,
story. However, I have also realized that when the students are pretty much clear of what a story should be like for
yeah.
example, in primary classes, we talk about problem and solution should be the essentials of story. So your story should have a problem and it should have a solution, so you should reach
Uh-huh.
to that. So
Yeah.
this particular trick helps the students build up their stories in a better way. And similarly,
Hmm.
if the students are in the middle grades, the senior grades, so the problem and solution gets differentiated in the form of the plot mountain that we talked about. So
Yeah, I
how much
really like
aware
the
and
plot
confident they
mountain.
are, they're confident about the plot mountain, they will be able to use that in their stories. And
Yeah.
many of them are scared because they don't know what to write. Once they get the direction that, okay, this is something that I can go to, this is plot mountain, I can always go back to, okay, I've written the introduction, what next? I have to write about the
Yeah.
conflict. And a few clues here and there can actually help the students write better as well.
Yeah. I know that the feeling of having to write a whole story must kind of be overwhelming. I thought the plot mountain was really good at um showing exactly how a story is made. It's like when you know how something is made, you can make it yourself, and that's really nice. I'll definitely use that in my classes. I'll use it in my secondary classes, actually. Yeah, I think I could use it with them.
That's great.
Uh-huh. So, and I also like the comment that you just said that for very younger classes, just problem and solution is enough, right? They don't need to go through each of the parts. Yeah, that's a
Yes,
good
otherwise
tip.
it will just complicate things for them.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
And also
Well,
providing them examples as well about problem and solution
yeah,
stories, which properly define.
yeah. So once you've worked on lots of spoken storytelling and they understand those concepts, then I suppose it's good to go into writing. Uh-huh. Um, and Anas asks, how could a teacher use stories with a large class, and Anas has pre-intermediate students. Does storytelling work with big classes, Shimona?
Sorry, I didn't get the question. Could you please repeat the question, Melissa?
Yeah. Does storytelling work with large classes? Anas has a really large class and they're pre-intermediate students. I think that's an appropriate level, but how about big classes? Can storytelling activities work?
Okay, so you're asking basically that when we take short stories in a larger classroom, how to make them work, right?
Yeah,
I
I think so. I mean, I
okay.
imagine that, I mean, some depends on the country, but I mean, here I might, in a primary class, I've got kind of people would have 25 students, but I know that in some countries it might be 40 or 50, and I don't know what's typical in your classes in Delhi, Shimona? What's a typical size?
Around 30, 35 students.
Okay, okay. Great. So if someone has around that, then yeah, these have worked. She's tried it, she's tested it, and it works. It worked fine. Great. Um, let's see if there's anything else. Um, there's a question about how you set things up from Rosanna. And Rosanna asks, do you read the story aloud? Or do the students take turns reading aloud, or do you read in silence? How do you prefer doing it in the class?
I think my classes are a mix of all of these things. A few days I am the one who's reading it. A few days my
Mm-hmm.
students read in the classroom. A few days there is silent reading going on. And
Uh-huh.
sometimes there is also buddy reading going on between a pair of, like I make students divide them into pairs and they have this reading going on. So depending
Mm-hmm.
upon the class, also reading out loud the things that I think are really important and I would want to take them in the classroom about that particular story. And then if I'm asking for some reflection from their side, asking them to go for the silent reading, uh, such
Mm-hmm.
strategies, a mix and match of these strategies actually work. Just using one particular strategy with all the students in every class, I think this is never going to work. So a mix and
Yeah.
match will always work in the class. And that's what I have been doing. And I also sometimes narrate a few parts, like we are reading a story and there's a
Mm-hmm.
very interesting part which I would like to narrate to the students. So we don't read at that point of time. I narrate that part and then we go back to reading. Or there's
Uh-huh.
one more interesting way that I've explored that sometimes, we have the movie versions of the stories as well. So, just to make them
Uh-huh.
visualize things better, like, for example, with the story Matilda, when we were reading the
Mhm.
story Matilda, we saw a few scenes also on the smart board where the students were able to visualize that, what actually happened in that particular scene. So mix and match
Yeah.
of these strategies actually works in the classroom.
Yeah, that's really good advice, isn't it? Like as many, I think another teacher said that in another presentation. It was Allegra. She talked about games and she says she doesn't play the same game twice in a row. She's always changing games, always changing techniques, and it's really good advice. Um, there was a comment on Facebook from Teodros about using videos of stories. And Tewodros says, in my classroom, students listen to stories from YouTube and write the second parts of them. That's quite a nice idea, isn't it? They watch a bit
Yes,
and they
yes,
write a bit. Have you ever tried
yes,
that?
yes. I've not done it with the form of watching a video and then writing, but we have tried it with reading, uh, one part of the text and then writing the next part of the story. So I think I'm going to take
Yeah.
this strategy from here and probably use it in my next class.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. Thank you for the teacher who sent that in. Um, there's a few questions that have come from Facebook actually. Riza asked about the digital resources that you showed. Do you know if you need accounts to sign in for those? Do they have free versions that teachers can use?
Yes, they have the free version, so they are easy to use and you can log in. They will ask for a normal sign up. You can sign in and then you can use
Mhm.
them.
Oh, great. That's good to know. Really good to know. And of course, the British Council Story Maker, you don't need to sign in to use that
Yeah,
one. Anyone
yeah,
can use it.
yeah.
I really enjoyed that. I like the story that you made. Um, and this is a different type of story. Someone's written a comment, and it's from Jasmine. And Jasmine says, "Can we use personal anecdotes to make short stories in the classroom?" I think so. Could be a good way to invent stories. What do you think, Shimona?
I totally agree with it, and I would guarantee, since I've used this particular strategy in my classroom, so I would
Yeah,
guarantee that such making up such stories in the classroom would actually help the students to connect with you in a better way. Like I
yeah.
remember when we're talking about pet animals and everything, so I narrated the entire story of how I secretly bought a pet animal in my house and I, hid it from my parents. Students were actually able to connect with me in a better way, and I had a better relationship with them after that class. So using such anecdotes in the classroom
Yeah.
and using them as the basis of stories can be a very helpful strategy. You all should try that.
Yeah, that's great. And it was an invented story. It wasn't real.
No, no, it was a real, it was a real story.
Oh, great. That sounds fantastic. Oh, Shimona, we're running out of time. A huge thank you. I really, really enjoyed your ideas and short stories. Next week, teachers around the world are going to be using them. So, thanks everyone for coming today. This was our fifth session for World Teachers Day, Saturday. It's not our last session. We've got another session coming up, and it's the plenary session. So don't go away. Go and have a cup of tea and walk around. We'll be back in 15 minutes with the plenary session. It's going to be an absolutely fantastic one. Let's say thanks to Rabia and Joanna who are helping here on Facebook, sorry, on Zoom, and to Karen who's on Facebook moderating for us. And of course, big thanks to Shimona. See you all for the plenary, 15 minutes time. Goodbye.